Aphrodisias is a place both that I was connected with and worked at, but was also a place that is a very interesting study of the Roman world, and is a very particular place in the sense that there are quarries of very fine white marble. There's also some black marble within a half-hour's walk of Aphrodisias. Sculpture was an important product, and the importance of its product is the fact that there are a number of sculptures now in Rome and in Copenhagen, as well as those in Aphrodisias itself, which were signed by Aphrodisian sculptors, in which they specifically put the fact that they were from Aphrodisias. Aphrodisias is also personally important because between 1982 and 1989, I worked virtually every summer for two and a half weeks at Aphrodisias, studying sculpture, the quarries, and the fact that they had excavated a sculptor's studio in Aphrodisias, so that there's considerable work there that we can see. So there's considerable unfinished work in Aphrodisias, which is one of the major sources for being able to study the techniques, as well as there's considerable. Aphrodisias itself, they produced a considerable number of monuments. One of the advantages with Aphrodisias is that very little modern work been done in the quarries. There's been a little more since then, but there was one small section which was quarried in 1966, and there were some marble from that. And so I would, most mornings, go out and go through the quarry and do some studying of the quarrying, but then I would carve the Aphrodisian marble. And I made it a habit, something of a habit, in traveling around Greece and Turkey to obtain white statuary marble from various quarries and try carving them to see if there were any stylistic differences that could be attributed to the characteristics of the marble. For instance, Thessian marble is an extremely hard marble. It's the hardest marble I've ever worked. Aphrodisian marble, on the other hand, is one of the softest of the marbles that there is, and quite easy to work. And in this case, both cases we're talking about pure white marble. Now, there are several important monuments that have been excavated in Aphrodisias. One of the most interesting and the most full of sculpture is the Sebasteon, which has been, I think, partly reconstructed now at Aphrodisias. It involved large bas-reliefs with large figures in them. That is, the bas-reliefs are something like over 5 feet tall by about 4 or 5 feet wide, and the figures are the full height of the relief. Now, it is interesting and notable that there was little or no work to create a smooth, tool mark-free surface as on the finished carvings. These are carvings which you may say that because they were set up slightly away from the observer, they didn't feel the need to finish them as carefully as they would something that was down at eye level. Not only that, but there's a difference between different ones. There's both stylistic difference, showing different sculptors, and the stylistic difference also includes a difference in finish, because one of the characteristics of all of them is that the background is left slightly rougher than the foreground. But you find one figure, one in which the figures are finished with a flat chisel, another one in which the tooth chisel is partly used for the finish. You find one in which is basically point chisel the background, and another which it's tooth chisel the background. My impression is that these carvings would have been carved on the ground, and then there is no multi-block work where they would have had to do the finish the work in place. That all of these are reliefs that were done, they're complete with their framing, so that there was no need to work up on the site. Now, the possibility is that the unfinish we see on one of the reliefs is because the relief had to be put in place before the sculptor finished it, and that there was no attempt to go up and finish it. It is notable, perhaps, the difference between what is going on in Rome and what was done here, because, for instance, Roman reliefs are more finished, even if they are going to go high up. The reliefs from the Arch of Marcus Aurelius that were done, that are now on the Arch of Constantine, are fairly neatly, evenly finished with abrasive. They're not polished, but it's a matte abrasive finish. And there is none of this seeing that you could leave it somewhat less finished because it was up in the air and not going to be seen too closely. And it's quite the opposite of the Column of Trajan, for example, where those reliefs are done with great intricate detail that is not going to be visible from the ground, but they're finishing it that way anyway. So there's a different viewpoint in a certain sense between the way the sculptors in Aphrodisias are working on architectural sculpture and the way sculptors in Rome were working on it. Now, at Aphrodisias, they discovered what is obviously a sculptor's workshop. It is 3 relatively small rooms crowded with sculpture. A whole series of different pieces of sculpture, a couple of them mostly finished and unfinished, and then there's a whole series of sculptures from the sculptor's workshop which were taken out in probably the late 4th century and put into the wall of the church that they were building right near there. There are 2 statues of Dionysus as a child being held by a satyr, and one is twice the size of the other, and they are not exactly the same, which is an interesting point. They were by and large finished. On the other hand, there are other statues which are unfinished. There's the bottom half of a seated figure, which is only partially finished. There is the lower part of another statue, a statue of a lounging figure, which was only partially finished. And they also discovered 3 tools, 2 point chisels and a flat chisel. And these tools are virtually exactly like modern tools. We don't know for sure how many carvers there would be in that workshop, whether it was one carver running it and people working for him, or whether it would have been more than one carver. We know relatively little that way. We do, however, have one bit of interesting evidence about carvers, which is that we have, I think, 6 sets of double front half of the foot, on which at least one of them has measuring knobs, and they are clearly, because sometimes one of them is 2 front halves of the feet on one side, and then on the other side of the block there's the same thing. And these really do seem to be training pieces. That is, that one of the things that an apprentice or somebody training would have to do would be to carve the front half of the foot. One of the more amusing combinations of this is that in 1962, during the summer, I worked for about 6 weeks in the marble carving technical high school in Carrara. And out in the back, they had a whole pile of works that the students had to do, which included a whole bunch of front half of the foot, exactly as with Aphrodisias. That is, and the students in their 3rd year had to carve an eye, lips, and the front half of a foot. And that this is part of because they're even signed, all of them. Now, one of the things we find a few examples of in Aphrodisias was characteristic throughout the Roman world, but somewhat surprising to find in Aphrodisias, which is the recarving of heads and portraits. We have a head of a bearded man which does not look like a portrait, but which is being recarved, in the process of being recarved. And you can see rough recarving around the beard. And one of the reasons you can be sure it's being recarved is that the ears, which are from the original head, are way too large for the head that they have now. I mean, he looks rather Dumbo-like with the ears. Now, basically, with the recarving, what they did is probably use a flat chisel and carve away any details which made for a portrait at one time and try to carve in new details. It would mean making it smaller, but not taking off any more than at the most maybe a centimeter of stone. Sometimes they would recarve the face, but leave the hair, and you see this kind of strange thing of the hair and the back of the head looking much too large for the face. There are various levels that it was done. The surprising thing about doing it at Aphrodisias is that the quarries are so near at hand. The quarries are half an hour away. I used to walk there every morning. And yet, with all that source of marble, they still evidently found it useful to reuse pieces of marble, possibly because already most of the carving had been done, so it would be relatively less work, but possible also because the expense of the marble was such that this was something they could get for little or nothing, and therefore it would be cheaper to do. Now, Aphrodisias in general is interesting because it gives us a total picture of the marble industry. That is to say, we have the quarries, and we have the industry of sarcophagus carving and architectural carving and reliefs and independent statuary.